He thought the badge on his chest gave him the right to decide who belonged in that courtroom. But before the morning was over, that same room would show him how small a man can look when truth finally stands up. The courthouse in downtown Baltimore had the kind of cold, polished silence that made every footstep sound louder than it should, the kind of place where people lowered their voices without being told, where even a nervous breath could seem out of place. It was just after 9 on a gray Monday morning, and the gallery was beginning to fill with attorneys, clerks, defendants, and spectators carrying paper coffee cups and tired expressions. At the far end of the room, beneath the state seal and the dark wood paneling, the bench stood empty for only a few more moments. Everyone was waiting for the judge. Everyone, except Officer Daniel Mercer, seemed to understand that a courtroom was supposed to humble you a little. Mercer moved through that room like it belonged to him. Tall, sharp jaw, pressed uniform, radio clipped neatly at his shoulder. He wore authority the way some men wore expensive cologne, too heavily and with the expectation that everyone around him should notice. His eyes swept the gallery with quick, practiced judgment, deciding in seconds who mattered and who did not. That was when he saw her. She entered without rushing, a black woman in a navy blazer and low heels, carrying no briefcase, no stack of files, no outward sign that she needed to prove anything to anyone. She looked to be in her early 40s, composed, self-possessed, with the kind of stillness that doesn't beg for attention but somehow commands it anyway. She took a seat near the center aisle, folded her hands, and fixed her eyes on the front of the room. That should have been the end of it. But men like Mercer were often unsettled by people they could not immediately classify. He stared a beat too long, then walked over with that clipped, impatient stride officers used when they wanted compliance before they had even spoken. "Ma'am," he said, his tone already carrying accusation, "this seating is not for loitering." A few nearby heads turned. The woman lifted her gaze to meet his. There was no fear in her expression, only calm, as if she had seen this kind of performance before and learned long ago not to reward it. "I'm here for the hearing," she said. Her voice was even, low, unmistakably controlled. Mercer's mouth tightened. He asked no one else for credentials, no one else for justification. Only her. "You need to move to the back until someone confirms why you're here." The words were formal enough, but the contempt beneath them was impossible to miss. The woman did not argue. She simply rose, adjusted the sleeve of her blazer, and stepped into the aisle. Then came the moment that made the room shift. Mercer moved too close, using his presence to force the pace, crowding her path in a way that made several people look up from their phones and legal pads. She stopped, not shaken, not flustered, just still. Imagine standing there in a room full of strangers, treated like an inconvenience for nothing more than existing with dignity. Most people would have shrunk. She didn't. She stood tall, eyes level, shoulders square, and for the first time that morning, Officer Daniel Mercer looked not powerful, but rattled by the simple fact that she refused to look away. The room did not erupt. It tightened. That was the strange thing about public humiliation in a place built on procedure. It did not always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it arrived in silence, in the pause after a command spoken too sharply, in the way a dozen people suddenly found the same spot on the floor more interesting than the truth standing in front of them. Monica Hayes remained in the aisle with one hand resting lightly at her side, her posture steady, her expression unreadable except for the faintest trace of disappointment, not in herself, but in the man trying so hard to diminish her. Officer Daniel Mercer mistook that silence for weakness. Men like him often did. He straightened his shoulders and glanced around the gallery as though he expected the room to affirm him, as though a uniform could turn instinct into law. "I gave you an instruction," he said, louder this time, his voice cutting through the stale courthouse air. "If you are here on official business, then identify yourself. If not, take a seat in the back and stay out of the aisle." His words were clean enough to survive on paper, but his tone gave away what his language tried to hide. Monica looked at him for a long second, then toward the empty bench at the front of the courtroom, where the judge would appear at any moment. "I am not disrupting anything," she said. "I am standing exactly where I need to stand." There was nothing dramatic in the way she said it, and that was what unsettled him most. She did not plead. She did not snap back. She did not offer him the scene he seemed to be chasing. Mercer let out a short breath through his nose, almost a laugh, but colder. Near the second row, an older defense attorney lowered his glasses and watched more carefully. A young clerk paused with a stack of case files held against her chest. At the press table, Nina Brooks, a local courthouse reporter who had covered everything from corruption hearings to police budget fights, glanced up from her notepad. She had seen ego before. She had seen nervous officers try to prove themselves in public. But something about Mercer's fixation on this one woman felt different, more personal, more revealing. "Do not make this harder than it needs to be," Mercer said. He stepped slightly to the side, not enough to clear the path, only enough to make the gesture look official. Monica did not move. The fluorescent lights overhead gave the room a pale wash, flattening every face except hers. Somehow she still looked composed, as if she had walked into harder rooms than this and left with more than her dignity intact. Her eyes shifted briefly across the courtroom, taking in the witnesses, the clerk, the bailiff near the side wall, the court reporter adjusting the machine at her station. She seemed to understand exactly how many people were watching and exactly how little she needed to do. Imagine knowing that one wrong reaction is all some people need to confirm the lie they already believe about you. Imagine choosing calm anyway. Mercer's jaw flexed. He was no longer maintaining order. He was trying to win. "Last warning," he said. "Move." The word landed harder than it needed to. Still, Monica did not flinch. Instead, she tilted her head just slightly, studying him with the kind of steady attention that makes a dishonest person feel seen in the worst possible way. For the first time, uncertainty flickered through his face. Only for a second, but long enough for Nina Brooks to notice it, and long enough for the people in the first two rows to exchange the kind of glance that says something is about to break, and not in the way the officer expects. What should have been a routine hearing now felt like the last few seconds before a summer storm breaks, when the air turns heavy and every person in the room senses the pressure without understanding where it will land. Officer Daniel Mercer drew himself up as if volume alone could restore the authority he felt slipping through his fingers. The courtroom remained standing, waiting for the judge to enter, but the usual restless shuffle had disappeared. No coughs, no whispered side conversations, just that tense courthouse silence, stretched tight enough to snap. Monica Hayes stood in the center aisle, calm as ever, her gaze fixed on Mercer with an expression that held neither fear nor anger, only an unsettling clarity. It was the kind of look that stripped away performance and left a man alone with what he really was. Mercer hated that feeling. He took one small step closer, forcing a little more pressure into the space between them, and lowered his voice as though that made him sound more in control. "You are done making a scene," he said. "Move to the back now." Monica answered without raising her own voice. "I am not the one making a scene, officer." That single sentence landed with more force than anything louder could have. A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Nina Brooks glanced from Monica to Mercer and back again, her pen hovering above the page. She had covered enough public institutions to know that the ugliest moments often came disguised as ordinary ones. One official voice, one citizen told to comply, one room full of people pretending not to notice what was plainly happening. Near the side wall, the bailiff Ryan Cole looked toward the entrance for the judge, then back at Mercer, as if silently hoping someone higher up would walk in before this went any further. But no one did. Mercer's face hardened. He was no longer speaking to maintain order. He was speaking to win back the room. "Do not test me," he said, and this time his words carried the sharp edge of a man embarrassed in public. Monica did not rise to it. She only turned slightly, as if preparing to continue forward on her own path. It was a small movement, almost nothing, but Mercer reacted as though he had been openly defied. He shifted into her way and made a sudden, careless motion meant to stop her progress, the kind of disrespectful physical interruption that can be disguised afterward as procedure by people who count on others being too intimidated to challenge them. Monica lost her balance for half a beat and had to steady herself, one hand brushing the end of the wooden spectator rail. A quiet gasp moved through the first few rows like wine through dry leaves. No one shouted. That made it worse. Every person in that room knew they had just seen something that should never have happened inside a courthouse. Mercer seemed to realize it too, but instead of pulling back, he leaned on the same arrogance that had carried him this far. "I told you," he said, louder now. "You do not decide where you stand in this courtroom." Monica slowly straightened. She smoothed the front of her blazer with a controlled, deliberate gesture that somehow restored more dignity than he had managed to take away. Then she lifted her eyes to his again. If Mercer expected tears, outrage, or pleading, he found none of it. What he found was composure so complete that it began to unsettle everyone around him for a different reason. Because people who truly have nothing rarely stand like that. People hiding fear do not recover that quickly into stillness. Nina Brooks felt it first, that small inner jolt reporters learn to trust. This was not over, not even close. And as Mercer stood there clinging to his badge like it could protect him from the truth, the courtroom began to understand that the woman he had tried to diminish might be the only person in the room who was fully in control. The sound that finally broke the tension was not a shout or a slammed door. It was the sharp crack of the side entrance opening as Judge Eleanor Whitmore stepped onto the bench and took in the room in one long, measuring glance. "Be seated," she said, her voice firm enough to cut through the charged silence that had gathered over every row like static before lightning. Chairs shifted against the polished floor. Papers rustled. The court reporter adjusted her machine. But the energy in the room did not settle. It only changed shape. Monica Hayes took her seat with quiet control near the aisle, one hand resting lightly on the arm of the wooden chair as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Officer Daniel Mercer returned to his post near the rail, though the stiffness in his posture now looked less like discipline and more like a man trying to outstand his own mistake. Judge Whitmore had spent nearly 2 decades on the bench. She knew the difference between ordinary courtroom tension and something darker. The first came from nerves. The second came from shame. As she scanned the faces before her, she saw too many eyes avoiding one another, too many shoulders pulled high, too many people pretending to focus on case folders they had stopped reading several minutes ago. "Before we begin," she said, setting her glasses low on the bridge of her nose, "is there any issue in this courtroom that requires my attention?" No one answered. That silence said more than words could have. Nina Brooks looked up from her notebook. Ryan Cole, the bailiff, shifted his weight, but kept his mouth closed. The older defense attorney in the second row stared straight ahead with the expression of a man who knew he had just failed a moral test and was not yet ready to admit it. Mercer kept his eyes front, jaw set, as if still hoping the machinery of routine would bury the moment beneath the day's docket. Then Judge Whitmore's gaze landed on Monica. It was not because Monica demanded attention. It was because she carried herself like someone who did not need to ask for it. There was a composure in her that did not match the energy around her, and judges noticed such things. "Ma'am," Whitmore said, her tone careful now, "are you all right?" For the first time since the morning began, the entire room seemed to breathe at once. Monica rose slowly, every movement measured, her blazer neat, her expression steady, dignity intact. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "I am all right." She could have said more. Everyone knew that. She could have pointed. She could have named what had happened in plain language and forced the room to confront itself immediately. Instead, she chose restraint, and that restraint made Mercer's earlier conduct look smaller, meaner, harder to excuse. Imagine having every reason to make a scene and deciding instead to let the truth ripen in front of witnesses. There is a kind of power in that which no uniform can imitate. Judge Whitmore studied Monica for a beat longer, then let her eyes shift toward Mercer. It was not an accusation. Not yet. But it was enough to make a faint line appear between his brows. He was beginning to understand that silence had not saved him. It had only preserved the moment until the right eyes could see it clearly. At the press table, Nina uncapped her pen again. Something about the woman in the aisle seat had started to trouble her memory in a different way now. The face felt familiar, not from the courtroom, but from somewhere else, somewhere official. She glanced down at her phone, dark screen reflecting the overhead lights, and a thought moved through her with sudden weight. Across the room, a clerk leaned toward another and whispered something too low to hear. Near the door, Ryan Cole straightened. The current in the room shifted once more, quieter this time, colder. Mercer felt it before he understood it. And for the first time that morning, the man who had acted as though he controlled the room began to look like the only person in it who did not know what was coming. The sound that finally broke the tension was not a shout or a slammed door. It was the sharp crack of the side entrance opening as Judge Eleanor Whitmore stepped onto the bench and took in the room in one long, measuring glance. "Be seated," she said, her voice firm enough to cut through the charged silence that had gathered over every row like static before lightning. Chairs shifted against the polished floor. Papers rustled. The court reporter adjusted her machine. But the energy in the room did not settle. It only changed shape. Monica Hayes took her seat with quiet control near the aisle, one hand resting lightly on the arm of the wooden chair as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Officer Daniel Mercer returned to his post near the rail, though the stiffness in his posture now looked less like discipline and more like a man trying to outstand his own mistake. Judge Whitmore had spent nearly 2 decades on the bench. She knew the difference between ordinary courtroom tension and something darker. The first came from nerves. The second came from shame. As she scanned the faces before her, she saw too many eyes avoiding one another, too many shoulders pulled high, too many people pretending to focus on case folders they had stopped reading several minutes ago. "Before we begin," she said, setting her glasses low on the bridge of her nose, "is there any issue in this courtroom that requires my attention?" No one answered. That silence said more than words could have. Nina Brooks looked up from her notebook. Ryan Cole, the bailiff, shifted his weight but kept his mouth closed. The older defense attorney in the second row stared straight ahead with the expression of a man who knew he had just failed a moral test and was not yet ready to admit it. Mercer kept his eyes front, jaw set, as if still hoping the machinery of routine would bury the moment beneath the day's docket. Then Judge Whitmore's gaze landed on Monica. It was not because Monica demanded attention. It was because she carried herself like someone who did not need to ask for it. There was a composure in her that did not match the energy around her, and judges noticed such things. "Ma'am," Whitmore said, her tone careful now, "are you all right?" For the first time since the morning began, the entire room seemed to breathe at once. Monica rose slowly, every movement measured, her blazer neat, her expression steady, dignity intact. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "I am all right." She could have said more. Everyone knew that. She could have pointed. She could have named what had happened in plain language and forced the room to confront itself immediately. Instead, she chose restraint, and that restraint made Mercer's earlier conduct look smaller, meaner, harder to excuse. Imagine having every reason to make a scene and deciding instead to let the truth ripen in front of witnesses. There is a kind of power in that which no uniform can imitate. Judge Whitmore studied Monica for a beat longer, then let her eyes shift toward Mercer. It was not an accusation. Not yet. But it was enough to make a faint line appear between his brows. He was beginning to understand that silence had not saved him. It had only preserved the moment until the right eyes could see it clearly. At the press table, Nina uncapped her pen again. Something about the woman in the aisle seat had started to trouble her memory in a different way now. The face felt familiar, not from the courtroom, but from somewhere else, somewhere official. She glanced down at her phone, dark screen reflecting the overhead lights, and a thought moved through her with sudden weight. Across the room, a clerk leaned toward another and whispered something too low to hear. Near the door, Ryan Cole straightened. The current in the room shifted once more, quieter this time, colder. Mercer felt it before he understood it. And for the first time that morning, the man who had acted as though he controlled the room began to look like the only person in it who did not know what was coming. Judge Eleanor Whitmore let the silence hold for one measured second, then another, as if giving the room one final chance to speak honestly before she required it to. No one moved. No one seemed willing to become the first voice in a moment that had suddenly grown far larger than a routine morning hearing. Nina Brooks looked down once more at the image on her phone, then slowly rose from the press table with the caution of someone who knew exactly how serious a mistake could become once spoken aloud in a courtroom. "Your Honor," she said, careful, respectful, but unable to keep the urgency from her voice. "I believe there may be an identification issue that the court should be aware of." Every head turned. Even the court reporter paused with her fingers hovering over the keys. Officer Daniel Mercer felt the shift instantly. It was no longer vague. It was no longer a feeling. Something was being brought into the light, and for the first time that morning he looked at Monica Hayes not with contempt, but with the beginning of dread. Judge Whitmore regarded Nina for a moment. "Go on." Nina glanced at Monica, then back at the bench. I received a city briefing over the weekend regarding a leadership transition at the Baltimore Police Department, she said. The photo attached to that notice appears to match the woman seated in this courtroom. The words landed quietly, but their effect was immediate. A murmur moved through the gallery and then died just as fast, swallowed by disbelief. Mercer did not move. He seemed to understand that any motion now might betray too much. Judge Whitmore turned her full attention to Monica. "Ma'am," she said, and this time there was unmistakable gravity in her tone. "Would you please stand and state your name for the record?" Monica rose with the same calm she had carried all morning, but now that calm felt transformed. It no longer looked like restraint under pressure. It looked like authority revealed at its own chosen pace. She stood straight beneath the pale courthouse lights, one hand resting lightly at her side, her expression composed enough to make the room seem restless around her. Then she spoke. "My name is Monica Hayes," she said. Her voice was clear, low, and steady, the kind of voice that did not need to be loud to command a room. She paused just long enough for every person present to hear the name, remember it, and measure it against what had already happened. Then she added, "As of this morning, I am the incoming police commissioner for the city of Baltimore." No one in the courtroom seemed to breathe. The stillness that followed was total, almost unnatural, as if the room itself had frozen around the truth. Mercer's face changed in a way no training could hide. The color drained from it first. Then the rigid certainty that had shaped his mouth all morning collapsed into something smaller and far more human. Shock, fear, and the unbearable realization that what he had done could not be undone, explained away, or buried beneath procedure. Imagine believing you are looking down at someone with no power, only to discover you have been standing in front of your own future all along. Near the side wall, Ryan Cole lowered his eyes. The older defense attorney exhaled slowly through his nose, almost like a man watching a verdict arrive. At the press table, Nina Brooks did not write for several seconds because even a reporter who expects truth to erupt can still be stunned by the force of it. Judge Whitmore remained perfectly still, but the look in her eyes sharpened. She understood the legal significance, the public significance, the institutional significance, but deeper than all of that was something simpler and more damning. A man wearing the uniform of law had looked at a dignified black woman, decided she did not belong, and acted on that judgment before learning the title he would have respected if prejudice had not gotten there first. Monica did not gloat. She did not raise her chin in triumph or let the room see even a hint of satisfaction. That was what made the moment feel so devastating. She had not come there to embarrass anyone. She had simply allowed the truth to arrive on its own schedule. And now Officer Daniel Mercer stood trapped inside it, unable to speak, unable to retreat, and suddenly aware that the woman he had tried to belittle was about to become the highest authority he would ever answer to. The room did not explode after Monica Hayes revealed who she was. It collapsed inward. That was the more frightening thing. Shock in a courthouse does not always sound like chaos. Sometimes it sounds like nothing at all, like every person suddenly becoming aware of their own breathing, their own posture, their own silence in the moments when silence had cost something. Officer Daniel Mercer stood as if the floor beneath him had shifted half an inch and left him struggling to find balance in plain sight. His hand, which had rested near his duty belt all morning with casual confidence, now hovered uncertainly at his side. The badge on his chest had not moved, but somehow it no longer looked like protection. It looked like evidence. Monica remained standing, composed, unshaken, allowing the truth to settle over the courtroom without interruption. She did not stare Mercer down. She did not need to. The weight of her name, her office, and the dignity with which she had endured everything before this moment had already done more than anger ever could. Judge Eleanor Whitmore leaned back slightly in her chair, eyes fixed on Mercer with the stern patience of someone deciding how much restraint the law still required when the facts had become so painfully visible. "Officer Mercer," she said at last, her voice measured but colder than before. "Is there anything you need to say to this court regarding your conduct this morning?" Mercer opened his mouth, then closed it. The delay said everything. He was a man used to quick answers, practiced excuses, and the reflexive protection of institutional habits. But none of those instincts seemed to fit the reality now. Facing him, he glanced once toward the side wall, once toward the back of the room, as if searching for a familiar face that might rescue him from the consequences of his own choices. What he found instead were witnesses. Ryan Cole, the bailiff, had straightened to full attention, no longer looking away. Nina Brooks sat with her pen poised, expression sharpened by the knowledge that this story had just crossed from local misconduct into something the city would remember. Even the attorneys in the gallery, people trained to say little until necessary, were no longer hiding their judgment. Mercer swallowed. "Your Honor, I did not know who she was," he said, and the weakness of that sentence was obvious the moment it left his mouth. Judge Whitmore did not blink. "That," she replied, "is not the defense you seem to think it is." A murmur almost rose in the room, then stopped itself. Mercer's face tightened. He had spoken the truth, but not the right truth. He had admitted the very thing that condemned him most clearly. He had treated Monica Hayes as though respect depended on title, as though dignity had to be earned through rank before it deserved recognition. Imagine revealing your own moral failure with one sentence and hearing it echo back at you from a room full of strangers. Monica turned her head slightly toward the bench. "Your Honor," she said, calm as ever, "I do not want this moment to become about me personally." That line alone changed the room again. She could have centered herself. She could have used the authority of her new office as a weapon. Instead, she widened the frame. "What happened this morning matters because it is not rare enough," she continued. "If it can happen this easily, in a courtroom, in front of officers of the court, then the problem is larger than one man's bad judgment." No one looked at Mercer now with pity. Even his own embarrassment had been overtaken by something more serious. Monica was not humiliating him. She was diagnosing the system that had made him comfortable enough to act the way he had. Near the courtroom door, a deputy from the clerk's office appeared and quietly spoke to Ryan Cole, who listened, nodded once, and then looked toward Judge Whitmore. A message had already begun moving through official channels. Word traveled quickly when power changed direction. Mercer seemed to sense it. He drew a shallow breath and stood a little less upright, as though the invisible scaffolding beneath his certainty had finally given way. He was no longer the man who had tried to control the room with suspicion and force of voice. He was simply a man in uniform, exposed by the distance between what that uniform meant and what he had done while wearing it. And as Monica Hayes stood there in complete control, without raising her voice even once, everyone in the courtroom understood the same thing at the same time. The chain of command had not only changed, it had arrived already watching. The message reached the courtroom in the quiet way institutional consequences often arrive, not with sirens or spectacle, but with a folded note, a whispered confirmation, and the sudden understanding that procedure had begun moving faster than pride. Ryan Cole stepped toward the bench and handed the clerk a slip of paper, which made its way to Judge Eleanor Whitmore. She read it once, her expression sharpening by only a fraction, then set it beside the docket as though the paper itself did not matter nearly as much as what it confirmed. "Officer Mercer," she said, her voice calm and exact, "you are to step away from your current assignment pending immediate review." No one in the room misunderstood what that meant. Daniel Mercer did not answer right away. It was as if he had spent his entire adult life believing consequences happened to other people, weaker people, people without protection, people without a badge. Now he stood inside a different reality, one where the same institution that had once made him feel untouchable was beginning to look at him with clear eyes. "Your Honor," he said finally, and even now his voice carried a faint, tired attempt at control. "With respect, this is a misunderstanding." Judge Whitmore did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "A misunderstanding is a misheard instruction," she said. "What happened here this morning was observed by this court." The words settled heavily over the gallery. Nina Brooks wrote them down at once, knowing they would matter later because they named the difference between confusion and conduct. Monica Hayes remained standing near the aisle, not triumphant, not visibly angry, simply present with the kind of composure that makes others measure themselves against it and come up short. She could have pressed the moment harder. Everyone in the room knew that. The city memo had given her rank. The truth had given her standing. But what she did next gave her something far more important. "Your Honor," Monica said, turning slightly toward the bench, "I am requesting that whatever happens next be done by policy, not emotion." Those words changed the room one more time. They stripped away any chance for Mercer to imagine himself the victim of personal revenge. Monica was not trying to break him. She was insisting that the standards of the office apply to everyone, especially the people trusted to represent it. Imagine being shown mercy not as softness, but as discipline. Imagine realizing the person you wronged has more control over herself than you ever had over your own power. Judge Whitmore nodded once. "That is exactly what will happen," she said. Ryan Cole then moved toward Mercer, not aggressively, not theatrically, only with the solemn professionalism of a man carrying out a necessary duty in front of witnesses. "Officer," he said quietly, "I need you to surrender your courtroom access credentials for the moment." Mercer stared at him as if the words belonged to some other man in some other room. Then, slowly, he reached for the clip at his belt and the identification attached to his uniform. His fingers did not seem as steady as they had earlier that morning. That small motion, so ordinary on its face, felt larger than any outburst could have. It was the first visible sign that authority had shifted hands. Around the courtroom, people watched without moving. The older defense attorney lowered his eyes. The public defender beside him folded her hands. Even the clerk, who had seen years of procedural drama, seemed to understand that this was not merely embarrassing for one officer. It was revealing for the whole room. Mercer handed over the credential, and for a moment his empty hand lingered in the air as though he still expected the old certainty to return to it. It did not. Monica looked at him then, not with cruelty, but with a directness that carried its own judgment. "A uniform," she said, her voice low and unwavering, "does not give anyone permission to forget another person's humanity." No one wrote that line down fast enough, though. Many would remember it later word for word. Mercer dropped his gaze. He had no answer because there was none. The courtroom had watched him act first on assumption, then on arrogance, then on fear. And now, with the badge still on his chest but the power draining out of the way he stood, he looked like what he truly was all along. Not a keeper of order, but a man who had confused control with character. Judge Whitmore called for a short recess. The gavel came down once, clean and final. Chairs shifted. People rose. But no one rushed for the exit. They moved slowly, almost reverently, as though leaving too quickly would mean escaping the lesson. Monica Hayes remained by her chair for another moment, composed under the courthouse lights, while Daniel Mercer stood a few feet away in the long shadow of his own choices, learning at last that the most devastating kind of justice does not shout, does not strike, and does not chase. It simply stands still and lets the truth remove everything false. When the courtroom doors finally opened for recess, the hallway outside filled with the low, stunned murmur of people trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Reporters checked their phones. Attorneys leaned close and spoke in careful half-sentences. Clerks moved more quickly than before, carrying papers that suddenly seemed to matter more. But inside courtroom 4B, where the air still held the weight of everything that had been exposed, Monica Hayes remained composed beside her chair as if she had not just watched a room full of strangers discover her name in the hardest possible way. Some people carry authority like a weapon. Monica carried it like a standard. She did not raise it to shame anyone. She only held it high enough for the truth to be seen. Judge Eleanor Whitmore stepped down from the bench and approached her with the dignity of someone who understood both the personal and institutional gravity of the morning. "Commissioner Hayes," she said quietly, offering the title without hesitation now, "the court regrets what occurred in this room." Monica met her with the same steady grace she had shown from the beginning. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said. "What matters now is what the system does after regret." It was the kind of sentence that did not sound rehearsed, because it came from experience rather than performance. A few feet away, Daniel Mercer stood near the side wall, no longer posted like an officer in command, only waiting like a man whose certainty had been stripped down to silence. He had not left. Perhaps pride kept him there. Perhaps disbelief. Or perhaps some final part of him wanted to see whether this could still turn into a misunderstanding if he stayed still long enough. But misunderstandings shrink under light, and this one had already been dragged into open view. Ryan Cole remained nearby, holding the surrendered courtroom credentials with solemn care, as though even that small plastic card had become part of the record. Nina Brooks did not crowd Monica with questions. That was not the mood of the moment. Instead, she observed, recognizing that the most powerful ending was already writing itself without her help. Imagine standing in a place where you were doubted, diminished, and judged on sight, and then walking out not bitter, not broken, but more clearly yourself than anyone in the room. That was what people would remember. Not only Mercer's disgrace, though there was plenty of that. Not only the shock of rank revealed in the middle of a courthouse. They would remember the contrast. One person had entered the room wearing visible authority and misused it. The other had entered carrying invisible authority and never once abused it. A uniform could force attention. Character could hold it. Monica turned at last toward the doorway, where the gray Baltimore daylight spilled through tall courthouse windows and laid long bars of light across the floor. As she walked, conversations quieted around her without anyone asking them to. There are moments when respect is not granted by office, but awakened by conduct, and this was one of them. Even those who had done nothing all morning felt the rebuke of her composure. She had exposed more than one man's prejudice. She had exposed the comfort of spectators, the weakness of silence, and the dangerous ease with which institutions can mistake order for justice. Near the exit, Monica paused and looked back once. Daniel Mercer had lowered his head, but not in reflection deep enough to redeem him. Only in the first raw recognition that a career can be undone long before official paperwork arrives. She did not speak to wound him. She spoke because some truths should not leave a room unspoken. People tell themselves respect is earned by title, she said, her voice calm, carrying just far enough. But the real test is how you treat someone before you know who they are. No one answered. No one could. Mercer remained still, caught inside the echo of that sentence because it named the exact place where he had failed, not as an officer, but as a human being. Monica then stepped through the doorway and into the corridor, where cameras lowered rather than lunged, where questions softened before they were asked, where even the courthouse noise seemed to part around her. She did not look like someone walking away from humiliation. She looked like the future arriving without apology. And behind her, in the room where Daniel Mercer had once believed he could decide who belonged, the lesson remained like a mark no one could wipe clean. He had looked at a dignified black woman and seen someone easy to dismiss. He had mistaken silence for weakness, grace for surrender, and power for something that only traveled with a badge. But that morning, in a courtroom built to sort truth from performance, the law did not announce itself through anger. It stood in a navy blazer, answered with restraint, and left one truth hanging in the air long after the room had emptied. He thought authority meant having the loudest voice in the room, but real justice had another face, and it never needed to shout.